Okay, now we're live.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Research Showcase in July 2021. My name is Martin Gerlach. I'm a research scientist here at the Wikimedia Foundation. I'm very excited to introduce today's speakers. We have Kai Zhu. He's an assistant professor of information systems at McGill University. He is the receiver of this year's Wikimedia Foundation Research Award. I must say one of the receivers of the year. And he'll present on content growth and attention contagion in information networks, addressing information poverty on Wikipedia. For the second half, we'll have Isabel Langrock, a PhD student at Edinburgh School for Communication at University of Pennsylvania. And she will present recent work on bridging Wikipedia's gender gap, quantifying and assessing the impact of two feminist interventions. At the end of each talk, we have time for Q&A. So if you have questions for the speakers, please put them in the chat on YouTube or on IRC. My colleague Isaac Johnson will monitor the channels and then relay the questions here in the room. I want to briefly say the unifying theme of this showcase is the analysis of what happens to articles that were edited as part of content campaigns. I find this really interesting, the approach to treat this as a natural experiment where articles from the campaigns are viewed as a treatment group and compared to a suitable set of articles from a control group. But to give a little bit more context around these content campaigns, before we start, I want to briefly pass it to Alex Stinson. I want to thank him that he joined. He's a senior program strategist in the community programs team here at the Wikimedia Foundation. And one of the focus areas there is the development of support for content campaigns. So please go ahead, Alex.
Hi, thank you for having me. As Martin said, I'm a senior program strategist on our programs team, which focuses on what tactics help Wikimedia communities do better outreach to create content, bring in new contributors, find knowledge gaps, and generally kind of integrate ourselves into the broader knowledge ecosystem like universities, museums, libraries, kind of general outreach. And one of the most common tactics across all these spaces are events like editathons, which are kind of small gatherings of individuals, maybe 15, 20 people in a room with some coffee and a topic that like learn to edit Wikipedia, or as we're going to be talking about more here, campaigns or these larger calls to action that kind of bring multiple types of events to get together, sometimes editathons, sometimes photography contests, sometimes other kinds of things like writing contests in order to fill the gaps on Wikipedia. Why do people do this? Why do we organize? Contributing to an encyclopedia, contributing to other free knowledge projects is not always motivating for folks. And so there's this kind of broad need as a movement to find ways to motivate and do calls to action, to invite people in and help them focus on meaningful content gaps. The challenge with this, and this is what the movement strategy, Wikimedia movement strategy focuses on in its topics for impact kind of framing, is that it's not always clear what is an effective intervention, where are the topic gaps, how to fill them, which ones are effective, which interventions are effective. And so these research projects, and I hope future research on topics like this, have a real role to play in helping us assess both the value and scale of these kinds of campaign interventions. And it's more than just like what we can do as kind of organizers or the Wikimedia Foundation, which is kind of focus on that kind of like, how do we improve the process of it? It's also asking these bigger questions. How does it affect the knowledge ecosystem around it? So I'm really excited to hear about this, and I have a ton of questions for towards the end, but Martin, is that the introduction you needed?
Perfect. This is perfect, Alex. Thanks a lot. And with this, let's go ahead with the first talk. Kai, please go ahead.
All right, so I'll share my screen. Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks for having me. So it's my pleasure to have this opportunity to tell you about our study on content growth and attention contagion on Wikipedia. So I'm Kai Zhu from McGill University, and this is work with Dylan Walker and also Lab Muchnik. So over the past decade, right, the open collaboration platform have fundamentally changed the way knowledge is produced, disseminated, and consumed. Wikipedia is probably the successful example of that. So every day, huge amount of information seekers end up getting what they need from Wikipedia. And I don't need an introduction or explanation of Wikipedia for this audience. This is particularly remarkable when you consider like all of this happened without a strong centralized governance. So Wikipedia uses a decentralized content production model. The community of Wikipedia editor essentially governs and coordinates by themselves. However, this content production model is not without its problems. And in fact, we know that Wikipedia is subject to knowledge disparity and information gap. It's in terms of both across geographic areas and across knowledge domains. So from some previous literature, Graham and co-author, they study how geotag Wikipedia articles are distributed throughout the world. They try to model and understand it using different explanatory factors, yet they still find some part of the world remain well below their expected values. And others have performed similar analysis across knowledge domain and found the same problem. So this is problematic because it can lead to the silo of knowledge and bias our perspective of what is important. What it makes it worse is it's not just a problem with Wikipedia, right? In fact, all type of collaborative information systems are susceptible to information skew and could have information gap. So we want to ask ourselves, why does this happen? Like, what do we know? And more importantly, what can we do about it? So what we know is that the geographic information skew and the digital divide will act to limit our understanding of and attention to the impoverished area in terms of economic, social, political, and cultural concerns. So the Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells had this really powerful quote where he said, most of Africa is being left in technological apartheid. And this is research being done 20 years ago, but modern research on digital divide indicates the problem is still with us today. So it's a big problem. And we also know that this is not just about the accessibility of information. It's more relevant to us about Wikipedia is the information unavailability has a surprisingly strong impact on a lot of real-world outcomes, like financial market, scientific advancement, and economic outcome, like, for example, tourism. And in fact, all of this study, at least here, is done with the information on Wikipedia. So it's Wikipedia matters, right? When we look at information system, typically across a variety of study, and we also see herding and popularity effect. So things are popular can drive disparity and inequity in the distribution. This could be a partial explanation of what we have seen on Wikipedia. So then we're looking specifically at Wikipedia. There's a lot of work on the motivation of editor. So it could describe why we have this distribution inequity. So this perspective is just being about we have people intrinsically interest or disinterest in certain type of information or topic, and then we don't have a proportional representation of editor as our population. So that could be a problem. Now, others have looked at information production and consumption at the article level and found they interact in complex and dynamical ways, like even in a rich get richer dynamic. So things already get a lot of attention, tend to get even more attentions. Particularly, King and Ramberson find evidence consistent with the consumption and production feedback loop. And they also found the network position in terms of the link for Wikipedia article is correlated with the content production and consumption of the article. But importantly, still today, we have no causal understanding of interaction between the content production and consumptions. So there are a lot of research study Wikipedia editor, their motivation and identity and so on. So that's very important. But here we take a different perspective in this study. We're gonna focus on the article instead. So in a complex like social technical system like Wikipedia, right? The articles are not independent. They are interconnected with each other via the hyperlink. So for a given article like this one, we would like to know how does the attention may be measured by page view, then will drive content production, and vice versa. How more content drive more attention attracted to the article. Moreover, does attention spill over onto other articles in the network? So this is the goal, but the problem is that in a natural setting, all different forces come into play simultaneously. So the causal inference is challenging. To overcome that, we leverage a nature experiment involving content contribution shock on Wikipedia. So the Wiki Education Foundation have conducted by far several years now the campaign where they work with a college instructor, so they can create assignment for college students to either create a new article or expand an existing Wikipedia article as part of their class assignment. So instead of writing a term paper, maybe only the professor will read. Now they can really have impact by making their own Wikipedia article. Then a lot of people everyone can access from the word. So a lot of articles have been added in this program. Right here, I listed some statistics, but I think it's by 2018. So now those number must be already much bigger. So the scale of this campaign is very large. And this gives us a chance to study what's the impact of exogenous content contribution, particularly the contribution to the underdeveloped articles. And the identification assumption for causal inference is that the content contribution by the college student is exogenous to the nature evolution of the article, in the sense that it would not have occurred during the same time period, at least in the absence of the campaign. So to infer the counterfactor of not receiving content contribution, we also constructed a set of control articles that did not receive contribution from students. Then we match them using causal exact matching with the treated article based on article characteristics. So here a student added, here a student did not. And this created a direct sample of direct treated and direct control. Then we look downstream an article that the direct sample linked to and collect the spillover sample. So here is the spillover treated, here is the spillover control. Okay, so what do we learn from this nature experiment? So first, we find that there are significant lift in terms of post-shock page view for a treated article when we compare them to articles didn't receive content contribution from students. It's about 12% lift on average compared to their own baseline page views. And the effect is long-lasting. It did not disappear even after 26 weeks after the shock. And we also found it's a stronger impact if we look at the subset which is less popular, which means they receive less page view before the campaign, and also when they receive more content from students during the campaign. So for this subgroup, it can achieve as high as 30% lift in terms of page views. And not only page view, in terms of future editing, right? So the treated article receives 3.7 more edits and 2.2 more unique edits on average in the 6 months following the shock. So after seeing this result, initial question we had is that, like, what drives increased attention? Where does this traffic come from? So this question about mechanism. So thanks to the release of clickstream data by Wikimedia team, we can look at the clickstream, then compare traffic source for both treated and control article. So what we found here is really the increased traffic come from both internal links and also external websites. So it's come from both. Internal traffic is explained by more incoming link added to treated article, and external traffic is probably explained by improved search engine visibility. Although we don't know how exactly search engines react to this change and how they rank the article, but we do observe there are 4.8 more visits per day come from search engine. So far, we have been focused on the direct impact, the page that received content contribution from students. So what about the page that didn't receive content but was linked by the treated article, right? What about attention spillover? So first, we know spillover happened just from the clickstream data. People do jump from page to page. This is directly observable. So more specific question we have is, do shock to contribution affect downstream articles? So about spillover of attention, so the key finding here is the creation of new link is very impactful. So when edit article, right, during the campaign, they can also add hyperlink on the page, pointing to other page, in addition to the textual content they added. So we can see in our sample, the student didn't do it enough, but when they do, this new link can serve to open the floodgate and allow attention to spill over. So both model-free evidence and the model estimate reveal that this has a substantial effect. All right, so here is the summary of finding from the nature experiment. First, the campaign to direct editorial effort to develop underdeveloped article have significant and lasting impact in terms of both page view and future editing. And interestingly, it verifies a positive feedback loop between content production and consumption in this kind of open collaboration system. Second, to dive into the mechanism, we found the increased attention come from both internal link and search engine, maybe slightly higher proportion from the internal Wikipedia when we compare to the existing traffic. So third, we found significant attention spillover through hyperlinks from treated article to the article is linked to. So the attention spillover is particularly significant. Okay, so this attention spillover really caught our interest. So it inspires us to think harder about like what making use of spillover to benefit the system, like the network. So like, can we go one step further, right, to learn more about the structure dynamic of the system that are beyond the estimate from the nature experiment? So we begin to wonder, can we create a policy to leverage the attention spillover, the dynamic to benefit information published region in the network? So imagine like two hypothetical policies. In the first one, editor were encouraged to focus their effort only on effort on highly related group of articles. Not only that, they deliberately also build up the link structure around those articles while they are adding textual content. And we term this attention contagion policy. In the second one, editor focus their attention on article without considering their relationship or network structure. This is gonna be our baseline policy to compare with. So we term it as an undirected attention policy. Then the question is, which policy is better and by how much? So we did a mean field estimation of the spillover benefit, which gave us some intuition. But I'll skip this and go directly into our empirically informed page rank simulation. So I believe a lot of us are familiar with PageRank algorithm. it used to be the base algorithm of Google search. The cool thing about our simulation is that we make diffusion follow empirical data on actual surfing behavior between Wikipedia articles. Again, thanks to the clickstream data, the actual surfing behavior is learned from the clickstream pattern. So here, the GIJ is the empirical probability to follow a link on any Wikipedia article. And here, the R0 is the empirical probability to land on an article from an external source. Okay, so here is a graphic depiction of the two policies we are comparing, what I just described previously. So there are a lot of subtlety about this simulation, like how we select the proxy for impoverished regions and how we match subnetwork for the two policies, how exactly did we do the perturbation. But I'll skip the technical detail and jump directly to the result. So indeed, we find the attention contagion policy needs to significant increase in access attention to the impoverished region, which is up to twofold on average. So here, the access attention is defined by the percentage difference in page rank number for article in the perturbed set. And we did it for both clicks and the community, and the result hold for both of them. So here you can see the blue color is our proposed attention contagion policy. We can see its value spread out to higher region of this distribution, and compared to the orange color, which is the undirect attention policy, whose value classed in lower region of lower value. So this implies that the informational gap can be better addressed using policy that leverage attention spillover. This is the takeaway of our PageRank simulation. Okay, so that's all about this study. But lastly, I just want to mention this idea I have, because ever since this study, right, I become very interested in the question about what's the value of a link in a network system like Wikipedia. So a lot of Wikipedia policy about its content, but less so on link structure between pages. From what we found, links are very important. It's powerful in channeling reader attention, and then attention may encourage future editing, right? So I would like to understand what could be the optimal link policy, and to do that, we need to be able to experimentally measure the value of different type of link. And this is something just had been on my mind for a while. Right? I just want to get this out. And if you're also interested in this, if you think there's an opportunity to do such experiment, I would be happy to talk more about it offline. All right, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kai. Thank you for the presentation. We have plenty of time for questions. So, yeah, start here in the room. Anyone? Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, so a characteristic of the WikiEd content is that it's professors selecting high visibility topics in their field that students work on. So they're not like the later study looks at largely biographies, which are like a lot easier to write and then the kinds of stuff that the students are writing. And I'm wondering if you kind of compared the effect to any other set of articles. So like biographies or monuments or towns, you know, things that are not normally of the type that the students write. And if you have evaluated any other kind of potential impact based on like topic area. For example, I know agriculture is atrociously covered on most of our wikis, and like it might behave differently than like chemistry or biology, which are the kinds of classes that WikiEd works with. So I'm wondering if you, or psychology or something. So I'm wondering if you've looked at any of those nuances, like how it changes based on topic or domain.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah, it's that's definitely right. So when we look at like the range of topic that work by students, it really spans from like a wide range of possible topic. Right? It's possible to be like science and technology, a lot of STEM topics, also some history and even biography. It's also possible to be biography. Right. So when we look at those topics, we thought about should we do like look at topic by topic. So we didn't look into like how the effect will, and then for example, heterogeneous treatment effect will be how it may differ across different topics. But first, we did a topic modeling, and in the matching I mentioned before, we try to match on topics. So in that sense, we try to make the comparison fair, right? So if a topic is belong to science technology in the treatment group, want to compare to article, like also about science and technology in the control group. So in that sense, we did deal with topic, but we didn't like look at how it might differ across them. But one thing like we were worried about, and we did a lot of work to try to make sure it's not the case, is whether this topic gonna be trending after student work on it. What I mean is it's not because of student editing, right? We worry about like if a student choose something to work on because they expect it might later become popular. So we did a lot of like effort. Also look at like, for example, search them on Google Trends to make sure we are not picking things that are trending. For a few ones that's possible, we exclude them from our analysis. Yeah, that's how, in this study with how we deal with the topic, but with yeah, it's gonna be it could be interesting potentially to look at how it might differ across different topics.
Thank you.
Anyone else or a follow-up question? Otherwise, we could go Isaac. I think there's a question from YouTube.
Yeah, we have a question from Ann Forrester on YouTube. She asked for, can you give an example of bias leading to changes in financial market outcomes?
Oh, yeah, that's a paper I cited. So it's work from previous some other researcher. That is about a Wikipedia page about corporate information, right? It's about companies. So I couldn't remember the detail of exactly what kind of information they added it to, but the essence of the study is also when they add more information about a company, maybe a scandal. Yeah, but they could observe like following that, the stock price react to the their change to Wikipedia article.
All right, thank you.
Pablo, you raise your hand.
Okay, sure. Well, first, thank you guys for this presentation. This is very good research. I remember that in the introduction you mentioned that in a complex socio-technical system as Wikipedia, articles are not independent but interconnected. But also is even a bit more complex because editions are not independent. Like editions in Wikipedia are also interconnected. So I was wondering like how your takeaway around like the relevance of policies for informational gap could be addressed if your research would focus also in a cross-wiki, like considering different wikis at the same time and how they could benefit from the existing knowledge and the existing gaps to fill those gaps and to create knowledge around.
Yeah. So by addition, do you mean different language addition on Wikipedia? I see. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Actually, so here in this study, we look at English Wikipedia. It's only about English Wikipedia. So those students come from either like it's North American college, So after this, it's definitely the information gap between different language editions is something very significant. In fact, I have a follow-up work that try to look at how machine translation, and maybe not only machine translation, just a translation tool provided by Wikipedia may help facilitate information flow between different language editions. So that's something ongoing right now. I learned a lot about like a cross-edition information gap on Wikipedia while I'm doing this. Something like surprising factor that the biggest, which is the language English Wikipedia, when we look at the overlap with like Germany, which is I think top few one, the overlap is only 25% when we look at like how do they cover the same like concept, right? So I think that definitely is like another place where knowledge gap is a senior issue on like Wikipedia.
Thank you.
Cool. I don't see, Leila, there is a question.
Just maybe one comment, not so much of a question, but as you may close this part of the presentation, I want to reshare that to us, one of the most exciting parts of the research that Kai and colleagues did is kind of showing really for the first time that there is value in investing and improving content in areas where we already don't have a lot of page views or a lot of attention, right? And this is not obvious. I think especially for the practitioners among us, I want to encourage to think really critically about the results of this study, because as we are choosing what to prioritize for people to contribute to, and I apologize for the background noise, I'll say that the tendency can be to say, we're going to focus on articles that are high page views and try to improve the content there. And that logic can make sense in certain situations, in certain topics. But there is a reality that this study shows that at least for certain topics and certain choice of articles, where we have low page views and low attention, we can change that by improving the article quality. And the result is really fascinating result in terms of kind of the care that has gone in for preparing the results, and also the actual implications of it for the work that the movement does.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. Yes, it's definitely right. I think a lot of beneficial things we found in this study, the community of Wikipedia editor already has been doing, like a lot of effort is coordinated around Wiki project, right, which is a way to coordinate editor to work on group of articles, so they can like receive like benefit from this group attention. Also, the Wiki campaign, Wiki education campaign we are looking at is also an effort to combat this issue, which is just there's some knowledge gap. The content wouldn't emerge organically by themselves without such intervention. And the college student kind of an ideal group to work on this. I think that is part of it. Something I think could be improved along the line is really the link policy around Wikipedia. I think it hasn't been received as much attention as the actual content. But in our study, it just found the link is also super important.
Last question, maybe Isaac from YouTube.
Yeah, we had another question from YouTube, Kai. This one's from Kaylee Champion. And she says, did you notice another form of spillover might be contributor spillover. So did you notice whether the content campaign drew in participation from the community? That is not just people in the campaign or class, but other editors on Wikipedia.
Right. This is something we're looking into. So we look at like after the campaign finish, in the 6 months after, right? We found there's 2 more new editors in addition to the student who work on the article. On average, 2 more editors that gonna work on the trade article. So it's kind of once they have something to work on, I guess it's easier for other people to contribute. Right? So that in that sense, it's not only just page view. also encourage future editing by others, not just the contributor in the campaign.
Wow, yeah, that really, I think, speaks to the impact of some of these campaigns, not just in producing higher quality content, but yeah, shifting attention and for readers and editors. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think if there are any follow-up questions, we'll have time to revisit after the second talk. For now, thank you so much for the presentation, Kai, and we'll go to the next talk by Isabel. Looking forward.
Great, let me share my screen quickly. So does that look good to everyone?
Yes, looks good.
Great. So hello, I'm thrilled to be at the Wikimedia Research Showcase. I am Isabel Langrock from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And I will be presenting some work I've been doing with my advisor, Sandra Gonzalez-Bayon, on closing Wikipedia's gender gap, assessing the impact of two feminist interventions. So as you are probably well aware, Wikipedia has a well-known and well-documented gender gap. Recent estimates suggest that all of the biographies on Wikipedia, only about 18% are about women. That's 350,000 pages for women compared to 1.5 million articles about men. Researchers have focused on this gap, mapping its contours and its relations to the gender gap among editors. Yet feminist movements are actively intervening in this gap, working to make Wikipedia more equitable. Our work centers the work of two of these movements in order to understand Wikipedia's gender gap through those who are actively intervening in it. And here we are going to focus on art and feminism and 500 women scientists. Our motivating question for this research is thus, how do feminist interventions impact the representation of women on Wikipedia? Are they creating more information about women? Are they able to change the representation of women on Wikipedia? And for the rest of this talk, I'll start by introducing our main research questions and how we went about assessing the work of these two movements. I'll spend a little bit of time kind of describing or walking you through what we use to evaluate the movements and the data that we use. The bulk of this talk will be on our main findings, and then I'll draw a couple of conclusions, and here I want to focus on the implications that our work has for both researchers of Wikipedia or gender gaps in other collaborative systems, as well as implications for kind of the Wikipedia community working towards building a more equitable encyclopedia. So first, I'll dive into kind of our research questions. But I want to start with these, introducing you to the two movements, so art and feminism and 500 women scientists. These are two distinct movements, but they're similar across several key features. Importantly, they're specifically feminist. So this is something that they kind of claim for themselves. It's not something that we're assigning to them. And they use this kind of language throughout their kind of marketing materials. They're creating a feminist intervention on Wikipedia. They are also welcome to editors of all genders. They encourage anyone to kind of come and edit Wikipedia. It's not just for women. They do this by hosting editathons, which are kind of those in-person events to edit Wikipedia in like communal spaces and with kind of communal resources. And they focus on training new editors. So you don't have to know how to edit Wikipedia prior to joining one of these events. Both are very like newcomer friendly. Importantly, for how we kind of design our research, they're both professionally oriented, as I think you can tell by the names of the interventions. And then finally, as the quotes here attest, they are focused on stories, and they see Wikipedia's gender gap as an opportunity to tell more stories about women. The lives and experiences of women become more accessible and shared when they are added to Wikipedia. And this is what their prime motivation for kind of editing and intervening in Wikipedia's gender gap. So we take this focus on stories and we operationalize it as a focus on content. Specifically, we look at if they are adding kind of more content about women than we would otherwise see on Wikipedia. And then we're also going to look at views. So not just are you telling the stories, but are they kind of being told, or at least are they being heard and read? So here we're going to look at kind of both the content additions as well as if they're able to kind of drive views to these pages about women. And then we have another research question that kind of goes beyond their specific mission and connects to kind of past literature on Wikipedia, which has also identified other areas where inequalities exist. So these are the structural features that have important roles in how Wikipedia is organized or internally organized, as well as being important to kind of the use of Wikipedia data in other digital projects. So whether that's leveraging Wikipedia data to train machine learning systems or kind of structuring internet search results. So we set out to evaluate whether in kind of focusing on content, they're also able to address these other kind of known areas of inequality. So to do this, we identify some key metrics and I'll talk about our data. So each of our research questions have a couple of different parts. So for our first research question, we kind of look at article length as the sign of content being added. We look at page views of if the stories are being heard. And then we also look at article quality. So this is the Wikipedia assessment of article quality. For our structural question, we look at two key structural properties that are very common. One is the info boxes, whether they're present, as well as the robustness, the number of labels within the info box, and then the wiki link network. And this actually resonates really well with Kai's talk from earlier. And I think there's some nice connections between our two studies with this aspect in particular. And I'll describe those two specifically a little bit more in depth later on. So to introduce our data, we collect information for over 11,000 biographical pages on Wikipedia. We have more articles about women than men, which was a specific design in our sample. And then our first group are the women artists and scientists, and these come from the edit tracking dashboards associated with the two movements. Because they are professionally oriented, we also identified two professional groups without large feminist movements associated at the time of data collection, which were politicians and athletes. So we used Wikipedia category pages to identify women within these two professions. Then through a similar process, we identified a long list of men and took a sample for each professional group. We reviewed all of the articles manually just to ensure gender consistency, but no one outside of the men-women binary were found, although we do highlight this as an important and kind of necessary area for future research on Wikipedia, as well as Wikipedia's gender gap. Also, as a quick note and kind of maybe our first sign of success here, the intervention groups include over 400 newly created articles. So these are articles that did not exist prior to their editathons and now can be found on the encyclopedia. So here are the distributions of several of our key variables. I won't kind of go in depth here, but you can see how they're broken out by professional group and by gender. We see similar patterns, but also some gender differences that start to emerge, which we will kind of test in our main findings. Also, as a note about the quality indicator, as I mentioned, we use Wikipedia's quality assessment tools for this evaluation, which lumps kind of the articles in different category indicators. Kind of at the top would be the best articles, and at the bottom are kind of the least well-written or kind of robust articles. And so now kind of moving into our main findings. So here we build some linear regression models to look at the impact of being a woman's biography as compared to men, as well as being one of the intervention women's biographies as compared to men. So we're really focusing on the top two, or the ones in the yellow box here. The rest are kind of our control variables for this model. So here we can see that with the non-intervention women have shorter pages than men, but the intervention groups kind of reverse this relationship, creating longer pages than we would expect to see. So they're adding more content about women than we would otherwise expect to see on the intervention, kind of speaking to the potential of like more stories, more experiences, etc. And we also see, kind of really importantly and actually really excitingly, that this relationship of reversal stays true for views. So they're encouraging more views than pages about women otherwise get as compared to pages about men. We don't find any significant differences in quality. This is potentially due to like kind of the breadth of the categories or the difficulty of kind of moving up and down a category. But to summarize these first set of findings for our first research questions, we find that the interventions flip the typical relationship between men and women's biographies on Wikipedia. They create longer pages that earn more views than we would otherwise expect. So this is a really good sign of kind of the importance of the work that these interventions are doing on Wikipedia. So moving along to our second research question, we first look at the info boxes. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, these are the boxes at the top right of a Wikipedia page. They are a quick summary of statistics like birth, death, nationality, kind of major works, etc. And they're optional if a very helpful addition for pages. Here, instead of kind of gender differences, although those exist, we do find some interesting professional differences, with men more likely to have an info box, which is this chart on the left here, except for the artist group. There we actually see that the women in our sample are more likely to have an info box present than the men. However, also kind of a surprising and really actually nice finding is that the athletes and politicians are really robust. Like they almost all have info boxes, a large percentage for both the men and the women. When we start to break down the size of the info boxes, then we kind of start to see these gendered trends emerge, with men having more robust or longer info boxes than the women, pretty much in all of the categories. And these are all statistically significant differences. We also look at the frequency of the labels and observe that the two intervention groups are more likely to reference families than any of the other professional gender categories. Politicians and athletes across both men and women do not commonly feature these attributes. I'm not totally sure why, but this is kind of a non-conclusive finding, but I think an interesting one nonetheless. Finally, moving to our kind of last finding here, we look at the link network, or the within Wikipedia link network, the wiki links. So I'm sure most of you are aware of the blue links, and especially after Kai's presentation, that direct the reader to other wiki pages. So for example, here's Dr. Bacon's page, who is a woman mathematician. So we can also find references to her elsewhere on the encyclopedia by looking at the incoming links. So here is Anne Bosworth-Fock, who mentions Dr. Bacon as a classmate down here. So this is these are incoming links, and they are a way to measure the presence of a page or a person outside of just their one biographical entry. We kind of use this as a way to measure the visibility of a person across the encyclopedia, not just what is happening on that one biographical page. The other type of link are the ones that are main topic page. So here, Dr. Bacon point outward, or an outgoing link. So here is the outgoing link to her advisor, Frank Morley. So this is what we would call an outgoing link. Yet this is an interesting case because we can notice that Morley does not link back to Clara Latimer Bacon, despite the fact that we might argue that he trained one of the first women PhDs is a relevant fact to his biography as well as hers. I would personally buy that argument. So these are kind of asymmetrical links, so he doesn't link back. And these have long been established as kind of a sign of gender bias in the past. They make men more popular on Wikipedia or more visible on Wikipedia and more easily found, especially if we think about Kai's previous presentation. With women women direct to more pages, but they don't get that interest or visibility returned. They're kind of sidelined within Wikipedia. So we want to test this within our own data and see if the movements are kind of addressing this. So here you can see the descriptive findings for our incoming links and our outgoing links. You'll notice that the outgoing link distributions are pretty similar across all of our groups, but we do start to see kind of pretty big differences, or at least visual differences, appear in our incoming links. Again, that means that women are equally directing attention outward, but they're not getting that attention returned, or they're less visible on the wider encyclopedia. And so to test this, we again use some regression models and find that, as the previous literature suggests, that these gendered forms of bias still exist. So women send out more outgoing links, although the intervention women send out fewer outgoing links, which you can see in this plot B here. But both women and the intervention women receive far fewer incoming links, suggesting that they are actually on the sides of Wikipedia, and that their visibility is pretty restricted. So I want to quickly draw some implications from this research. First, just kind of focusing on some limitations and some kind of research questions I think that this project can extend to. First of all, we use observational data, so our editing behavior remains obscure. We have no idea why the movements might be editing in a certain way, or kind of if revision edits from other Wikipedians or page deletions might be playing a role in what we're seeing here. We can't really attest to that. We just know that these are kind of the impact of the interventions, or these are what the intervention articles look like compared to similar articles. We also only look at the English edition. I think it would be fascinating to see how gender gaps compare across language editions and how kind of feminist movements in different contexts might work to intervene in those. Finally, we're only looking at one kind of demographic, and a binary one at that. So what happens with non-binary biographies? This is pretty much an open question. And then it would be great to be able to extend this analysis to the race and ethnicity gaps that exist on Wikipedia, which are harder to measure, but are just as important. Finally, we draw two sets of implications for this research. So for researchers, I want to kind of make two arguments here that we need to be more granular in our investigation of bias. It's not enough to just focus on content, because then we wouldn't see kind of these discrepancies within these structural features. So identifying important structural features in how the data is organized can be really important sources and often overlooked sources of gender bias in our research. I also hope that this work shows the importance of featuring and focusing on women-led work. So while much of the kind of gender gap literature focuses on this deficit, or the kind of the gap itself, activists are already kind of intervening within it. And as researchers, we can kind of help shine the spotlight on their work and help evaluate what they're doing by putting their work at the center of our research projects. Finally, for the Wikipedia, or the larger Wikipedia community outside of just the researchers, one of the biggest takeaways from this work is that the feminist interventions are making a change. They are working towards building a more equitable encyclopedia, and supporting them in any of the ways that they ask should be one of the primary kind of focuses of the wider Wikipedia community. We also kind of think that algorithmic aids that target these structural features, whether that's in identifying topics to include in info boxes or identifying these asymmetrical links that could become reciprocal ones, could be one of the key features that would help support their work moving forward. We also want to end on this kind of bittersweet note that this is an issue of scale. There's about 1 million biography gap between men and women on the encyclopedia. And while the interventions are making a difference, the gap remains too big to be solved anytime soon with just these interventions alone. So creativity and scaling up are definitely needed to create a more equitable encyclopedia. So to just briefly kind of summarize the outline of this talk, the feminist movements were successful at adding content, but structural inequalities still exist on Wikipedia. We argue that future research needs to differentiate the particulars of gender gap. Focusing on content might obscure the gaps that exist within structural features. However, we think the Wikipedia community has plentiful opportunities to better support the work of these feminist movements in building a more equitable encyclopedia. So thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments. If you want to reach out and get in touch, you can find us on Twitter or email, and you can check out our paper using this QR code, which is currently under review.
Great. Thank you so much, Isabel, for this presentation. I open it up for questions. We have plenty of time to cover things. Also, to note to anyone who's listening on YouTube, put your questions in the chat. Then I will monitoring and relate here. Otherwise, I open it for the room here first.
Since I'm the first person with a hand up. Biographies in general have like a really long tail in terms of like page views and content engagement and whatnot. I'm wondering if you did any normalizing on that. So like if you just took an average of a random sample of biographies, I bet it probably like all the averages are probably drawn up by like a very small set of very popular content, right? So question one. Question two, have you thought about taking this further into other gender gap adjacent topics? For example, digging into things that are unique to kind of our high interest to women audiences. So things that stand out are like women's health, right? Which has probably a very unequal balance and need. Have you done any similar analysis just to see if it's behaving differently or if we can find like similar patterns sitting under the surface?
Yeah, so first, to your first answer, we do log transform everything for the regressions, and we have multiple different models that are all kind of robust. They show the same trend that we depict here. So they're in the paper or the appendix of the paper if you want to check those out further. But yeah, that is, again, kind of this long tail is definitely something we noticed with just a couple, even though we took a sample, a couple definitely had way higher views or editor counts than others. For your second question of the content, I think that would be a fascinating area to extend this. It's not something I've necessarily looked into, especially because these movements are mostly focused on biographical content, although they do definitely edit other pages. So the focus here is on biographies. I think it would be really interesting to look at kind of what you suggest with the content, but I'm not, if anyone wants to get in touch and think about ways that we could do that, I would be really interested in kind of collaborating further on that idea.
Kind of one follow-up question too. One thing, so I've been digging through a lot of our editathon data, and one thing I've noticed, especially on these, both the feminist interventions and other strategic knowledge gap interventions, is that like Afro descent communities, is that when these events are run, a small handful of very experienced editors tend to do most of the intervention rather than the bulk of the participants that are registered. I'm wondering if you've seen a pattern in who ends up initiating most of the content, because that might change the result, right? Like if you have way more experienced Wikimedians producing all the high quality content, that kind of favors more of a women in red style approach than say doing the large call to action that art and feminism has focused itself on.
Yeah, I think that's a trend we observed in the 500 women scientists, with a couple editors kind of doing most of the edits we see. Again, our focus for this project is kind of on the content itself, but I do think kind of a user-focused addition to this paper might be an interesting kind of secondary paper out of the same sort of data. But it is for the art and feminism, I believe I would have to kind of go back to the data, but I believe we had a lot more kind of contributors to the edits that we look at.
Leila, you want to go next?
Sure. Isabel, thank you so much for the presentation. I want to particularly thank you for focusing on this space and having the courage, commitment, and persistence to do research and encourage others to do research in this space. This is definitely an area of research and investigation that we see a lot of value in. And I know from the experience of our team that doing research in the equity or inequity space can have its tolls on the researchers. So I thank you for stepping up and doing this research and sharing it with us. I have one question for you, which was early on you mentioned that you noticed that there are more page views for the articles that were intervened. And I wanted to ask you, what period of time did you look at when you looked at page views? And I wonder whether this increase in page views was sustained, basically.
Yeah, we collected the data in, I think, spring of 2019. So that would be when it's from. We don't have over time, but that would be a great second analysis. I can't speak to that. But yeah, if the interest is sustained, would be a great addition.
Thank you. That's it on my end.
Isaac, there was something in YouTube I heard from.
Yeah, we've got two questions from YouTube right now. The first one's from Jan Ainali. He says, what can future interventions and other topics learn from this?
Yeah, sure. I think the biggest one is that I think there's a lot of opportunity for interventions to kind of train people or focus on these kind of structural features. I think that would probably be common across all editathons that are training new people or either focusing on content. Especially I think this link issue is one that, like, showing people how to look at the backlinks or identify articles that would be good to link to those articles could be a great addition to the training materials for other interventions. I also think hopefully that there's a little bit of hope that these articles are kind of creating change with their focus. And so that while I don't have the data for any given movement, that hopefully this is at least somewhat encouraging to other similar kind of editathon-based movements.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for newcomers especially, I think the link adding piece can be a nice, simple task. And I think Wikimedia Deutschland is working on improving template editing. So hopefully that brings info boxes to a easier entry point as well. Thanks. The second one is about the interaction between notability policies and kind of bias in these articles. And it's from Ann Forster. And she says, do notability rules emphasizing success within a field's hegemony produce bias? So do awards that, we are known to be biased towards men, for instance, lead to bias within what sorts of articles meet the notability criteria and get improved? Yeah, definitely. I think there is quite a few articles that speak specifically to this issue. I know I'm going to mess up her name, but someone just published an article kind of about deletions and notability that just came out. That's really fascinating. And I think directly speaks to that. We don't necessarily look at whether these people, we don't have a notability metric, I guess, here, but the fact that they are on Wikipedia, I think is helpful, or should suggest that they are notable enough. But I think that's one of the biggest concerns of these movements, just kind of working with them and kind of observing their work for a while now. I would say a lot of the attention of kind of feminist editathons are making sure that you have enough references, making sure that you have enough variety of references to kind of sidestep these notability debates that seem to plague women's biographies much more than other articles. So that is a concern of these two movements that they're addressing, and hopefully, even though we don't have the deletions work, like the fact that there are 400 new biographies from this set of editathons, and that there are longer pages, hopefully that attests to their success in kind of working through these notability rules. Great, well said. I believe it's Francesca Tripodi, Ms.
Yes,
categorized.
that sounds right.
Yeah. Thank you.
I saw there was a request to, if you could share your last slide. I think it was people trying to find your paper. So if you want to put this up during the remainder of the Q&A. And Pablo, you had another question, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Martin, and thank you, Isabel, for this presentation. This is very good research as well, and I subscribe what Leila said about the relevance of your research in this domain and how you're approaching to it. So I really like from your presentation and from your research how you did not only focus on adding content about women on Wikipedia, but also how it affected the structural biases and that might limit the visibility of that content. So in the end, you mentioned several limitations that are present in many studies with Wikipedia data, and I would like to add another that is also present in many other studies, and formulate a question around that is like, how can we measure the value of those feminist interventions beyond Wikipedia and beyond Wikipedia data? Like, how can we see the value that also relates with one of our previous research showcase, like what is the impact of doing this intervention on Wikipedia for our societies, and how can we measure that?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. I think some of Kai's work, maybe there's a good partnership in here to see how these articles kind of direct attention outward or to other places on Wikipedia. It could be really interesting to like follow kind of those views around or follow that interest. I think the bigger kind of more like philosophical one goes back to the original kind of motivation of these movements of making sure that women's stories and experiences are available or are accessible. And I think the difference of, Googling someone and seeing that they don't have a Wikipedia page, at least anecdotally, is kind of delegitimizing of that person, or like, oh, they must not be important enough. And there's several instances, like high profile instances of this. I think Wired published an article back around the election about a senator who didn't have a Wikipedia page and how that kind of played a role in her campaign, or a senator, someone running for Senate. And so I think like those would require different methods of study of trying to see like what that impact of not having a Wikipedia page is and what the impact of then having one is on people's reception or kind of what they think of the work that they do. That should be kind of a primary focus, because I think this is really important and kind of goes back to both the motivation of the movements or like their reason of being, as well as the wider information landscape.
Thank you very much.
I have another question if there's not more in the room. So one of the things I've heard consistently from these organizers and other people who run kind of biography editathons in general is that like it's hard to like get people to stick around afterwards because like the emotional stakes are either too high, like you get into a deletion discussion and it's just like entirely demotivating, or the stakes are too low, like the relationship to the individual they're writing about is just, it's like another person on a list. And I'm wondering if you've kind of picked up on either retention or like the stuff the earlier presentation was looking at, kind of potential to activate more editors afterwards at all. Like, are any of those things kind of in your portfolio? Did you see anything in the data when you were playing with it? Yeah.
So far, I haven't looked at any of the user data beyond just kind of cursory, like who was in here, like how many people kind of thing. So I think that's a definite prime area of study of kind of what the editors are engaging with and how they're working on Wikipedia. We really focus just on the work that they do. So yeah, I can't really answer that question, but I think it's very important. I think there's a lot to be like gleaned from these editing interventions, and specifically the ones that kind of take this activist bent, because they're also trying to intervene in the kind of culture of Wikipedia that, you know, highlights, I don't know, more masculine or kind of more like patriarchal normative ways of knowing. And so I think the ways that they intervene is like super promising for future research and ways to kind of understand how we might think of more equitable or kind of diverse, open, collaborative systems. Because we see the same thing in Wikipedia as we do in kind of other open source systems like GitHub or, you know, open code work that I think is really fascinating. And so looking at these activist groups allows us to kind of reimagine what that openness might look like. So I'm right there with you and wanting to kind of know, but I don't unfortunately have all the answers here.
Kind of something in response to that. So I'm on a team that's going to start working on like registration of people at these events. And I'm wondering if there are any like signals in the data that you would want collected in order to interrogate some of these things. Like what kinds of dimensions or dynamics would help you as a researcher take advantage of like investigating these kinds of stuff?
Sure. I mean, I should probably think about this longer and get back to you, but right off the top of my head, definitely like demographic stuff. So like gender, race, where someone's coming from, like if they're a university student. I know there have been editathons at my university. I think looking at that would be really interesting. Kind of measures of like how comfortable they are with Wikipedia, or if they've ever like edited before, that type of thing. Are all definitely things that I think would be helpful to further understand, you know, who's editing Wikipedia, especially as part of these movements.
Cool.
Isaac.
Yeah, we have a question from YouTube, and then I have one myself. The one from YouTube is coming from Ann Forrester. And she says, you know, for the presenters, but also for any of the research staffs, I think this is kind of open to anyone on the call who's interested. She says, if applying multiple simultaneous objective notability criteria to a population tends to result in a notable subpopulation with even less of minority population or minority proportionally. So notability policy, maybe that, you know, affects women more than men, and then you add another policy and it keeps on kind of snowballing to that degree. What can be done to debias? So I think, to me, at least, this question is kind of about like, what is the relative balance between trying to improve content and add more links and add info boxes and things like that versus the like more larger structural changes around policies and the balance of those two.
I mean, I think it's a very important question, and one that I think maybe some of the research team would want to also chime in, but one that requires, I think, bigger changes than I've discussed here. I think the movements do an important job by kind of building their own set of norms and practices within their own editing techniques, but they do still kind of come up against the Wikipedia norms. And so I think that's an interesting tension to kind of see how it works through, and kind of the privileging of notability or kind of equity debate, I think, is kind of long going on Wikipedia.
I think to add to what Isabel just said, the question reminds me of a talk that Asaf Bortov gave in Wikimania in South Africa in 2018. I'll put the link to the file. The title of the presentation was "What Can We Learn from the Feminist Movement?" And one of the learnings was, and this was to the audience of Wikipedians and Wikimedians, and one of the learnings was that one should use their privilege to make a difference. And the examples around privilege were when you have a seat at the table within the Wikimedia movement, when you can make a difference and you can actually change policies, don't be silent and participate. I think at the end, we need to do many things at the same time for being able to make a significant step forward. So I'll share the link, but that immediately brought that presentation to me, the question that was asked.
Thanks, and I'll pass that link on in the chat later if you can find it. My question then was, and I apologize if this was already spoken to, because sometimes I miss these things with tracking questions, but I'm curious for both of the panelists today, what sorts of data you weren't able to kind of access that you would have liked to in doing some of these studies, especially the kind of quantitative side of them?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, you can go first.
No, you can go ahead. Feel free.
Okay. Yeah, there's something I have been thinking about. One particular thing I always would like to have, but I don't have access, is about page view. This is both about measure the impact of Wikipedia and also about knowing the knowledge gap. Is I would like to know a little bit more about who are the reader, particularly where they come from, at least at the country level, for this particular page, right? Where the traffic broke down to different location. That would be nice.
Yeah, I think there's all sorts of, I think, ways that I would want to extend this analysis, whether it's like looking at the full kind of article length or things that are just a little bit more computationally tricky. But I think for this one, I think one of the biggest kind of difficulties is like not having to manually review all of our pages of if they're men or women. So having even just like a pronoun section in the info box would have gone a long way to kind of helping us do that algorithmically, or just like very simplistically with like a couple of lines of code, rather than having to go through all of the articles ourselves to make sure they're in kind of the appropriate bins. I also think that's one of the harder things about doing kind of this gender gap research, of all the kind of work that you have to do to make sure that you're kind of categorizing people correctly. And especially for like non-binary folks who fall outside of this man-woman binary, it'd be really great to have a category or something that's easy to look up those and to look at articles that have been kind of worked on by the movements and then cross-validate them as, you know, in the right category. So that would be really great. The other thing that was kind of troublesome in our data collection process was that when we went to collect the articles outside of our intervention groups, we used these like category features, and there were plentiful categories of like women basketball players, women senators, like women presidents across the history or something like that. But there's no comparable articles for men. So while we might have categories that are all men, they aren't. There are also categories like senators that would just include both men and women, but then there would also be a women senators category. So that made it really tricky to collect, ironically, the men data, even though we had a list that was like, I don't know, 6 times as long as our list of women. So that for me was one of the biggest tricky parts that I wish there was an easier way to kind of collect. Or yeah, I guess address or something like that.
Yeah, thanks both. Kai, I'll say to your question about the geographic page views, there is a just released a few months ago from the data engineering team, a like up to top 1,000 page views per day from each country. And we're trying to expand that data set out. So hopefully in the nearest future, we should have slightly more data on that. And then Isabel, to your point, so at least internally, when we do a lot of this work, we try to use Wikidata, but I do understand that's kind of, it can be difficult to connect article data to Wikidata because a lot of the dumps don't kind of contain those connections natively. So maybe that's a call to make some of that a little bit easier. Because I know we've had some of the same challenges with categories where kind of that default assumption of if there is no gender or no, whatever identity it is, how do you handle that sort of category when you're trying to do some of this identity-based analysis? So I know we've been trying to use Wikidata more and more as kind of a structured repository of a lot of that content. But it can, trying to make it easier to access those kind of properties alongside the articles. Sounds like that's something that would be useful. So thank you.
Thank you, Isaac, for these comments. I think with this, we can close the showcase, but before finally close, I want to thank both of the speakers for the great presentations. And before we finally close, I want to make two announcements. Number one, speaking of data, we have recently released two COVID-19 related data sets around readership. This is what I understand around COVID pages related to COVID, what is the readership to those. So if you are interested in that, to check out these data sets, you can find more information on the Wiki Research L mailing list, our public mailing list, or you can reach out on our IRC. I'm happy to provide more information there. The second point I want to mention is that there will be no showcase in August. And the reason is we will be at Wikimedia, the conference around Wikimedia projects, probably the largest of its kind in the Wikimedia world. I would encourage to register and attend, but we also have some sessions that we are organizing there, and maybe Pablo can say 2 sentences about that to give a shout out.
Sure, thank you, Martin. Yeah, we will host a session called Indicators for the Wikimedia project. So it will be an open discussion around the development and impact of indicators to characterize Wikimedia projects. So we will present some social and technical challenges in defining these metrics in different projects, the Knowledge Gap Index, the Knowledge Integrity Risk Observatory, and a community health project that was granted by the foundation. But we aim to spend most of the time on an open discussion. So whether you're an editor, a volunteer, affiliate, or a researcher from the Wikimedia movement, please join us. The date will be announced. It's not confirmed yet, but it will be announced and shared through our channels, for instance, through the Wiki Research Twitter account.
Thank you, Pablo. I'm looking forward to that. I hope you can join us there. After that, I have nothing much to add besides thanking again the speakers, thanking again the audience for joining in this great discussion. That was really nice to see. That is always, I really enjoy that. I want to thank Isaac for taking the questions. That always helps. Otherwise, I would not be able to keep track here. And I want to thank also Jana and Emerald for the support of making this happen, for announcement and the setting up the live stream here. For the speakers, if you want to stay a few minutes longer to chat, feel free, but otherwise we'll close the live stream now. I wish everyone a good rest of their day, wherever you are. Bye-bye.